All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining JINSA for another webinar as we enter the fifth week of the war with Iran, continuing our analysis of everything that's happening. Today, we're talking about the prospect for negotiations and diplomacy ending this conflict, or whether greater escalation lies ahead. I'm Blaise Michel, JINSA's Vice President for Policy. I'm delighted to be joined by an all-star panel of diplomats and defense professionals. Just going down the list here, we have Ambassador Eric Edelman. He's a JINSA Distinguished Scholar and the former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Elliot Abrams, who's a former U.S. Special Representative for Iran and Venezuela, which might be relevant to topics of discussion today, and a member of JINSA's Iran Policy Project. And Steve Rademacher, a JINSA Senior Advisor and former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Nonproliferation. I guess let me just start by trying to figure out where we are based on comments from President Trump, who yesterday said that we had very good negotiations with Iran. I do see a deal with Iran, could be soon, but at the same time, it's possible we won't see it. And then we negotiate with them, and then we always have to blow them up. Today, in a Truth Social post, he said that the U.S. is in serious discussions with a new, more reasonable regime to end our military operations in Iran. That great progress had been made, but also, if for any reason a deal is not shortly reached, the U.S. will conclude our lovely stay in Iran by blowing up and completely obliterating all of their electric generating plants. So I guess let me start with you, Ambassador Abrams. Are there negotiations happening with Iran? Is there sort of a diplomatic channel open? What's going on?
Thank you, Blaise. Let me start by saying I'm not speaking here on the basis of secret information that I have. It seems that there is a channel in that the Pakistanis are able to pass messages back and forth. We haven't even gotten to proximity talks where two parties are in the same hotel but not in the same room. And if you look at the American conditions and the Iranian conditions, boy, are we far apart. I think one of three things is going to happen. I think there will be a deal reached soon, within the next, let's say within this week, or there will be some kind of escalation by the United States, or there will be a cessation of the war without a deal. And I must say, I think, look, the war is going to end. Whether it ends in 3 days or 2 weeks, it's going to end. It actually seems to be to me, more likely that it ends with each side agreeing to stop the use of force rather than the negotiation of an actual 1 or 2 or 10-page agreement, because I don't think we really are close enough to have such an agreement.
Uh, Let me ask you, then, Ambassador Edelman. President Trump has presented his 15-point plan to the Iranians. He said yesterday that the Iranians have given us most of them, I guess referring to those points, but publicly, at least, the Iranians are rejecting all 15, as best as I can tell. What is the divide here between what President Trump is asking and the Iranians are asking? And is it possible that we might find them coming to some sort of agreement?
Well, I largely agree with what Elliot just said. I do think it's extremely difficult to parse what's going on in the sense that both sides are prevaricating. I don't think that we've had, to Elliot's point, President said in his Truth Social post that we've had both direct and indirect talks. There may have been some communication directly between Foreign Minister Araghchi and Steve Witkoff, but I don't think there have been any other real direct communications between the two sides. And the Iranians have an interest in also downplaying the fact that there's been discussions between two sides. So it's a little difficult to actually get a sense of how much has been conceded by the Iranians and how much uh, room there is for actual scope there is for actual agreement. The president said that as a sign of respect and as part of a test that he set out for the new rulers of Iran, that they had given him a great gift of allowing 10 or now maybe 20 Pakistani tankers to transit the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. Um, I don't doubt that the Iranians may have tried to dress this up as a gift to the president. But it's a funny kind of gift because it's mostly a gift to themselves, since these tankers were um, moved to safe passage through a channel created by the Iranians through the strategic deployment of a handful of mines, 10 to 12, in the strait, and may have paid as much as a $2 million toll, and maybe perhaps per container per tanker in order to transit this. I mean, the total result of which, when you add in the lessening or loosening of sanctions on Iranian oil by the administration, which is an effort to keep the price down. I think last time I looked, Brent had hit $113 a barrel. Um, the Iranians are now making twice as much revenue from oil sales as they were before this conflict started. So from their point of view, this is not a terrible kind of outcome. The one I mean to suggest is the one that Elliot just outlined, in which everything just stops, and we go back to the status quo ante. And I say that because if that were to be the case, Iran will have demonstrated that they can close the Gulf at will, and therefore, from their point of view, they will have survived. They will have established their ability to close at will the strait, and therefore, in a perverse way, they will say, "We won."
And do we have any idea when President Trump says he's negotiating with this new, more reasonable regime in Iran, who he has in mind? Presumably, it's not Mojtaba Khamenei. Um,
just one word about that, if I could.
yeah.
Um, Whether it's Galibaf or a group around Galibaf, um, these are new guys in power. They were under the late Supreme Leader. I think one of the reasons it's very tough to get a deal is that a deal means compromise. It means concessions. And who wants to come into power and have to make concessions immediately? Concessions that will be within the regime extremely unpopular. And who has the power to make those concessions? What's the mechanism by which it would be agreed within the regime with a supreme leader who is apparently out of action? So I think that question is pushes me in the direction of saying, there'll be a kind of ceasefire rather than a deal.
Blaise, I know you want to get Steve in here, but if I could just add one thing to what Elliot said, by all accounts, the balance of political forces inside the regime since this started has moved in the direction of domination by the IRGC. I mean, the regime was already heading in that direction before this started, but the various uh, decapitation strikes that have been a part of this military campaign, I think, have accelerated that process. And although one reads that there are some kinds of fissures between President Pezeshkian, for instance, and Ahmed Vahidi, the commander, the newly ensconced commander of the IRGC, about the resilience of the Iranian economy and how much they need to keep fighting or not fight. I think it's going to be, at the end of the day, the IRGC that calls the shots. And for that reason, I very much agree with Elliot. It's hard to see how, a compromise of very kind of basic, Iranian red lines, could be accomplished here. I could be wrong, but that's how I see it as well.
So yeah, Steve, wanted to get you in here on your take on the feasibility of diplomacy, but also to broaden the discussion a little bit. Um, Do we think that President Trump really wants a diplomatic agreement? Is that his preferred way out of this war? Is he serious about it, or is it just sort of emotion he's going through? What's your take?
Well, first of all, let me say I agree with my two colleagues about the immediate challenges of trying to negotiate. The strategy pursued by the U.S. and the Israelis was to decapitate the regime, and so that the first tier of leadership has been removed, and we're now dealing with the second and third tiers. And I think it's quite predictable that in a scenario like that, there will be a struggle for power among those who have survived, and probably the thing that could be most fatal to anyone competing for power in the current environment is to be seen as prepared to accede to the demands of the Israelis and the Americans. So, finding a negotiating partner who's in a position and willing and able to agree to the fairly maximalist demands that the Trump administration has made diplomatically will be very difficult. And I think we see that reflected in the fact that Speaker Ghalibaf has been identified by the president as his interlocutor. Ghalibaf immediately denied that he's speaking to President Trump. And, the Iranians, in fact, deny that they're negotiating at all. And I think the reason for that is the first Iranian who says, yes, I'm negotiating with President Trump. He may not end up with a bullet in his head, but he will, I would expect, immediately be out of contention for power in the current context. So I find it very hard to imagine someone on the Iranian side signing a piece of paper or entering any sort of commitments right now with the Trump administration. But you asked separately, does Trump want a negotiated settlement? I think obviously he would love to be able to use force as he has done and have that result in reluctant acceptance by Iran of the demands that he has been making of the Iranians all along. That would be a huge victory for him. And to get the Iranians to agree to do all the things that the Trump, it's basically, capitulation by Iran on all the issues that have been points of contention: the nuclear program, their missile program, their human rights policies, their support for proxies throughout the region. That would be a wonderful victory if we could get them to agree to do all those things. We could hold them to that going forward. But the likelihood of that is slim. So I think among the options that Elliot identified at the outset, we're more likely looking at either just a decision by Trump at some point to declare victory and hope that Iran also declares victory. And they've certainly put the pieces in place to declare that merely by surviving that they have emerged victorious. Or, well, short of that, escalation. And we don't know where that would lead, but it looks like Trump is putting the pieces in place to do that. And of course, the skeptics are saying, well, that's his real plan all along. He knows diplomacy is not going to go anywhere, and he's just using diplomacy as a fig leaf to buy time in order to then take the next step militarily. I doubt that's his preferred option. I mean, Donald Trump was not elected to involve the United States in ground wars in the Middle East. So I think he will only do that very reluctantly, but he may be forced to do that.
Steve, let me stick with you. And I mean, all three of you have highlighted that it seems that Washington and Tehran are pretty far apart. And so the 15-point plan that President Trump has proposed is probably a non-starter. But is it a good deal? What he's asked for, is it the right deal? Should the U.S. demand more? Could it accept less than what's in that 15-point plan? Steve, what do you think?
Well, I think I've not, the 15-point plan has not been publicly revealed, so I can't tell you with certainty that it covers all issues of concern to me. But from the descriptions I've seen of it, the only thing that could take the plan further would be a demand of regime change. That basically the Islamic Republic, the leaders step aside and turn over power to some new government. It's pretty maximalist demands, well beyond anything that would have seemed realistic before the use of force.
Ambassador Abrams, your thoughts? Good
I agree.
deal. Should
That
we
would
take
be
a
a
deal
great
that's
deal.
less than those 15 points?
Well, as Steve said, it's maximalist. It's everything we want. And I would assume that there is some room for negotiation on those 15 points um, if we get into a serious negotiation. But as I said, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think you're going to see the two teams, sitting there in Islamabad exchanging papers and, weeks of detailed negotiation as if this were the JCPOA. I don't think that's going to happen.
Hmm. Uh, I guess let me stick with you, Ambassador Abrams, and ask you about some of the international players that are involved or could be involved in negotiations. Starting with our coalition partners in this war, Israel. What's your sense of Israel's position on these negotiations and desire for a diplomatic deal?
Well, I think the Israelis have a target list, and it seems that they're getting to the end of it, as we are. Um, the on the nuclear sites, the missile sites, the drone sites, etc. So what remains? The 440 kilograms of highly enriched uranium and the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the Strait of Hormuz, presumably, if you got some kind of ceasefire deal, would then be open. And the question there is, yes, but can ships freely go through it? Does Iran, in essence, set up a toll booth there? That's not an Israeli issue. That's an American issue and a Gulf Arab issue. So from the Israeli point of view, I think there's one big thing left by this weekend, say, and that's the 440 kilograms, which they would presumably like to see taken or bombed sufficiently that it is completely unreachable and unusable. But I do think they're getting to the end of their lists, and they have reason to turn to Lebanon. Hezbollah has really jumped into this war needlessly and fully, and the Israelis now have a significant number of troops on the ground, and they need to deal with and want to deal with Lebanon. So I don't think if, say, on Saturday, the president said it's over, I think the Israelis would go along, and I don't think that they would do so with regrets. The Arabs are a different story because they need the Strait of Hormuz to be open. It's critical for all of their economies.
Hmm. Ambassador Edelman, sort of continuing on that, about a year ago, President Trump initiated Operation Rough Rider against the Houthis in Yemen, which lasted for about a month before President Trump announced that it was over. And there's some sort of a ceasefire agreement with the Houthis that applied to American vessels, naval vessels, but excluded or did not mention Israel at all. Is it possible that we end up with sort of a similar scenario this time around, that there's a deal with the Iranians that sort of is about the war between the U.S. and Iran, but doesn't include Israel?
I mean, with regard to the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz?
Or Iranian attacks
Oh,
on Iran or on Israel, or the Houthis
uh,
attacks on Israel, as we've seen this
well,
weekend?
it would be hard for me to see how the president could, say the war is over if the Iranians were continuing to strike Israel or our Gulf Arab allies. Where I thought you were going was, a comparison to build on Elliot's point about
Yeah.
what kind of regime will govern the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz once hostilities cease. I mean, a couple of points I think are germane here. One is, first of all, in the last 2 days, the Houthis have twice weighed in and fired at Israel, which, Up until then, they had been the dog that didn't bark. One might have
Yeah.
assumed that they were staying out of the war because they thought that Iran was no longer the strong horse in the region, and therefore and that therefore they couldn't be protected
Mm.
from strikes by either Israel and or the United States. They've chosen to do that, but in a way which would suggest is meant to signal that they can do more and that they could create a second front, as it were, at a critical maritime choke point for the region. And so I think that's been concerted between Tehran and the Houthis as a warning shot across President Trump's bow. Um, I think it's notable that since that quote ceasefire deal, the bulk of commercial traffic, as I understand it, has decided not to try and transit the Red Sea and go through the Suez Canal, but is taking the long route around, um, uh, the Cape in Africa. And I think, if we don't get a clear resolution to Elliot's point of what the status of the Gulf is, that is a huge problem for our Arab allies in the region, but also for the United States, which has traditionally maintained the rights of freedom of navigation around the world and access to the global commons. So I do think that right now, I think if the Iranians thought they could get a deal where everybody walks away and there's no specificity about what, comes next with regard to the Gulf and the Strait, that they would see that as victory. And I think it would be very problematic for our Arab allies, who, by the way, are also, to some degree involved in this mediation effort. The Qataris were involved at the outset. They've now stepped back and sort of yielded pride of place to the Pakistanis, who have some direct connections to the IRGC, to the Egyptians, to the Turks, and over the weekend in meetings in Islamabad to the Saudis as well. And I'm not sure the president understands exactly kind of um, the ramifications of everything he put in his Truth Social post, but the threat to attack desalination plants is potentially, I think, a precursor to a kind of no holds barred escalation that would see both sides trying to destroy all the infrastructure on both sides of the Gulf if we went down that road. And I say that because um, the Iranians, of course, are suffering from a huge water emergency right now.
Mm.
Um, but our Arab partners are totally dependent as well. I mean, if the Saudi desalination plants were taken out, they would have to evacuate Riyadh within 72 hours. And you had an attack today against a Kuwaiti desalination plant by the Iranians, which was a response, they said, to a reservoir in Khuzestan that was hit. Again, I think this was meant as a signal about what could come next if we get another round of escalation. And so I think the escalation, if it comes, to Steve's earlier point about a round of escalation, could start moving in a direction that could be quite catastrophic for that part of the world.
I did want to get to some of the countries involved in mediating these talks. But first, maybe ask you, Ambassador Edelman, since you brought this up, what would a workable arrangement for the Gulf,
Mm.
for the Strait of Hormuz, for ensuring that traffic can get through there that does address the economic concerns of our Gulf partners, what would that look like?
Well, I think there'd have to be some renunciation by the Iranians of, first of all, any intent to collect tolls. They have publicly suggested that the Strait of Hormuz, which is they regard as entirely in their, I mean, it's contested, right? Because some of the islands that control the head of the strait are actually traditionally been claimed by the UAE, but have been occupied by Iran since 1971. So you'd have to have some renunciation by Iran that they have any attempt that they're going to make any comparison, for instance, to the Suez Canal, where tolling is a function of an international treaty agreed in the 19th century, and that they're not going to try and use their ability to uh, close the strait, to mine it, to attack shipping in the strait as a way of impeding traffic, at their whim. So there'd have to be some kind of formal understanding, I think, about all of those things.
Steve, Ambassador Edelman mentioned that sort of the usual culprits that the U.S. has turned to negotiate with Iran, the Qataris, the Omanis, are not present in whatever communications are happening between Washington and Tehran. Do you have a sense of why that is, and why we've had these other partners, the Pakistanis and Egyptians and Turks and Saudis, step up?
I like your characterization of the Omanis and the Qataris as culprits. But well, so Pakistan seems to be in the lead now as the new mediator that's stepping forward and offering to try and broker a deal. One interesting dimension with Pakistan is that within the last year, they entered a mutual defense pact with Saudi Arabia. And they probably thought at the time that that this was a good deal, that basically the Saudis would subsidize them and come to their aid if they had any problems. And as you know, they have many problems. But at the moment, with Saudi Arabia under attack from Iran, it's possible that Pakistan will be called on under this mutual defense agreement to come to Saudi Arabia's defense. And of course, Pakistan borders Iran, so that would be quite a complicated situation. So I do think Pakistan is highly motivated to help resolve this, and that may account for their eagerness to be involved and to try and help arrange a deal.
Blaise, can I make one observation about what Steve just said? Because I agree with him. I think the problem here, though, is that not just the Pakistanis, but the Turks, the Egyptians, and others, all of whom are incentivized to want to see this come to as rapid a conclusion as possible, are going to be refracting whatever messages are being passed through the prism of their own interests.
Mm-hmm.
And my own experience in diplomacy, and some of it which I share with Elliot, in the run up to the war in 2003, for instance, we had a lot of helpful intermediaries trying to pass messages back and forth between the Turkish government and ours about what it would take to get the 4th Infantry Division into Turkey as part of the military plan to reduce Iraq militarily very quickly. And it all came a cropper because, when you've got a lot of, cooks in the kitchen passing messages back and forth, trying to shade things to their own, interest, it's just a recipe for miscommunication and miscalculation in my view.
There is, if I could jump in there.
Yes, please.
Question of what are we hearing from the Gulf Arabs? The news reports are consistent, rightly or wrongly, in saying that the Gulf Arabs have, maybe this isn't quite the right term, but been radicalized. That is, they did not want this war because they feared that the Strait of Hormuz might be closed and or that Iran would attack them. And both have happened. But it does not appear that their messaging to Washington is end the war today, please stop it now. Rather, they have moved, if you will, to the Israeli point of view, that this is such a dangerous regime that either it should be changed, or if that is not possible, and it seems that it is not possible right now, then it needs to be attacked and attacked and attacked so that its ability to do this again is greatly diminished and pushed far into the future. And
Yeah,
that will,
if I could just add to, oh, I'm
yeah,
sorry, Elliot. Go
no,
ahead.
no, please.
I, just to add to what Elliot just said, I mean, the UAE has been disproportionately attacked, and what's come under attack has been all of the things they've invested the last 40 years in building, right? The tourist infrastructure in Dubai, economic, Dubai as a air hub around the world. All these things are now at risk. And so it's not surprising, I don't think, that um, you would see them as being, to Elliot's phrase, radicalized by all this. The Omanis, I believe, have sort of blotted their copybook with the administration because they kept insisting that there was some kind of nuclear deal in the works that was sabotaged by the president's, launching this war. I mean, I've got my own criticisms of how this was done, but having said that, even Rafael Grossi has said there was no nuclear deal on the table. I
Yeah.
mean, that's just nonsense. But I think that has offended some folks in the administration. So I think they're no longer seen as a reliable, intermediary. And the Qataris, were, I think, quite active up until Ras Safan was hit by the Iranians. And then I think they voluntarily stepped back because of the kind of radicalization effect that Elliot was talking about.
Hmm.
Well, so we've described two groups. One group more eager to see this war end quickly and helping trying to mediate talks or pass messages back and forth. And one group of the Gulf Arabs that's been, as you put it, Ambassador Abrams, radicalized and eager to see the war through to its end so that the Iranian threat is severely degraded. But there's a Venn diagram there, right? Like the Saudis seem to fit in both sides of those two groups. I mean, they're part of the Pakistani, Egyptian, Turkish cabal there on the talks, but they've also, we've heard reports that MBS is together with the Emiratis pushing President Trump to finish this war. So which side do they really fall on? What do they really want? How are we to understand them?
Well, I would say first, I think they all want this regime dead. But they recognize that that is very unlikely to happen now. I mean, the truth is we have no idea whether it happens in 6 months or 6 years or 20 years. But um, short of that, it's a real enemy. It's not an imaginary enemy. It's not a potential enemy. It is an enemy that decided to attack them, and as Eric says, to attack the lifeblood of the regime. Um, so I would put the Saudis in the extremely hostile to Iran camp, which raises some interesting questions. Therefore, what? Therefore, are they in a closer alliance with the United States than they were 1 year ago? Or what about their relationship with Israel? What about their relationships with each other, which have been tetchy in the last year?
Are
I,
those questions you'd care to hazard answers to,
No, Eric is going
Ambassador?
to answer all the
am
questions.
not going to answer those questions because they're great questions and I don't know the answers to them. I do think, though, as well, that the Saudis, who are past masters at hedging, also can look at down the road a little bit, and they look at some of the president's Truth Social posts, for instance, suggesting that he might be ready to wrap up the war, et cetera. They have to consider the possibility that, the United States will declare victory, as, Steve and Elliot said earlier, and then walk away and leave them facing a kind of wounded, but very dangerous Iran, as Elliot said, a clearly avowed enemy. And then I think if that were to come to pass, what I would predict you would see from at least the Saudis, I'm not sure about the Emiratis, um, is both an effort to tie themselves closer to the United States, but also to China, and also to try and, you know, play, nice doggy with the rabid dog to their north, in the hope that it would keep things calm. I think that's what you would see, but that's, speculation on my part.
Why China, if I can ask? I mean, the Chinese have been a essentially useless ally for Iran. What are they going to do for Saudi Arabia? I mean, they've not been useful, I mean, in helping Iran, nor in influencing Iran to not attack Saudi Arabia.
I, I think just because China has been cultivating the Gulf states for a number of years. They were the ones who arranged the Saudi-Iranian, détente a few years ago. Um, and I just note with interest that the outcome of the weekend's meeting in Islamabad, among Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi, was that the Pakistani foreign ministers are going off to Beijing to try and see if they can get the Chinese to be, quote, guarantors of
Mm.
whatever, agreement might be reached in this diplomatic process, of which all three of us, I think, are very rightly skeptical.
Yeah, so I would just say about the Chinese that if you look at the list of who's most harmed by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, China is pretty high up on the list because they most of their energy. I don't know if it's most, but a very large percentage of their energy comes through the Strait of Hormuz, and that's now cut off. So it's a quite rational calculation by the Saudis and others that China is motivated to reopen the strait and probably has more leverage over Iran than most any other outside party. So apart from the Russians, but of course the Russians are motivated to keep the strait closed because it increases the price
Right.
of their oil. But for China, that's not a good outcome.
Mm.
China wants to have the strait reopened.
I can see,
Yeah,
I mean, for Iran, um, the war will end, and they will then have a terrible rebuilding problem. Their economy was in very bad shape before the war, much worse now. And particularly if we and the Israelis spend the week hitting some more economic targets like steel mills, um, and as they look around for investment, I guess what are the two options? What are the options? United States, Europe, um, China, and their Gulf neighbors. Boy, it's hard for me to see even the Saudis who were trying to make nice with Iran. Hard to see them after this war and these attacks saying, well, we'll help you and we'll invest $50 billion in this or that. Um, so China may be a better bet for some investments.
It's hard to imagine the Emiratis also allowing Dubai to be used as a
Yeah.
throughput for dual use goods going to Iran to help rebuild its, ballistic missile and drone programs. I think they'll be much more cooperative with, various efforts to crack down on all that.
Yeah.
especially seeing that today, I believe there was an announcement from the UAE barring all Iranian citizens from entering the Emirates, which I
Oh,
think goes to Ambassador Abrams' radicalization point. But Steve, wanted to come back to you because you mentioned we've talked about China, you mentioned Russia, and I believe the Iranians have also requested that Russia be part of any potential negotiations. Um, should the U.S. accede to that? What role could Russia play in negotiations? Why would Iran want them there?
Well, I guess if you're the Iranians, you don't have that many friends. So, if you could find a friend and get them at the table, that would be to your advantage. I don't see any advantage to the United States in having Russia at the table. Um, what I'm kind of, I mean, it's quite clear, and there's been press reporting that the Russians are at a minimum providing intelligence support to the Iranians, helping them target American military forces in the region and potentially helping them target the friendly Arab countries as well. You'd think that would be of concern to President Trump, who's had to go to Dover, Delaware, to receive the remains of Americans who've already perished. And I think Russia has their blood on their hands. So the Trump administration has other levers it could use against Russia to try and dissuade them from continuing to support Iran in this conflict. I don't know whether they're thinking about using them, but my advice to the Trump administration would be to keep the Russians out of the diplomacy and trying to get them out of the war.
Yeah. You're muted, Mike.
Yeah, sorry. Wanted to maybe delve a little deeper into nuclear issues with you, Steve. I believe Ambassador Abrams sort of touched on one of the major concerns being the 450 some kilograms of 60% enriched uranium that's still in Iran. Presumably, it seems buried under rubble since Operation Midnight Hammer, but I'm not sure if we've ever verified its location. What would a diplomatic, is there a diplomatic agreement possible that would, provide for the safety of that material without it leaving Iran? Would that have to be part of, do you think, any sort of deal or conclusion to the war? Is there a way to safeguard it if it were to stay? What would we have to see?
Well, again, we haven't seen the details of the 15-point proposal that the Trump administration has made, but I would expect one of those points would deal with the enriched material and hopefully provide for its removal from Iran, which is really the only safe thing to do it. If it's retained in Iran, but under international seal and subject to international inspections, I would take very limited comfort from that because the Iranians would have the ability to reclaim that material anytime they wanted. So, it certainly could be part of a diplomatic settlement to provide for the removal of that material from Iran, but we've already discussed the improbability of a diplomatic settlement in the near term. So I don't think the odds of that are very high. The other option that's being talked about freely is sending in the U.S. military to remove the material. And of all the military options on the table for the U.S., that one to me seems the most risky. I mean, I certainly understand why it's of great importance to us to obtain that material and remove it from Iran if we can. But so far as we know, most of that material is buried at sites that were attacked back in June. And if it were easy to access those sites to remove the material, I assume the Iranians would already have done that. And if they've already done it, then we've got to go somewhere else to get the material. And I don't know where that would be. Maybe some agencies of the U.S. government know something about that, but I've seen no press reporting to suggest that the material is anywhere except where it was when Operation Midnight Hammer took place. A military operation to go in there, it seems quite complex to me. I mean, we would have to insert U.S. forces in locations in central Iran where they'd have to defend a perimeter and be subject to not just drone attack, but artillery and infantry. And we'd have to maintain that perimeter long enough for them to dig down to where the material is, extract it, and then we'd somehow, I guess, have to airlift it out of there.
Steve, you forgot the part about they've got to get the heavy equipment in along with the troops with, the excavators to be able to go down and do that.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, if it were easy to do this, you'd think the Iranians would have already done it. And hopefully the Iranians haven't done it. And the idea that we can do it under fire, I mean, that's quite an ambitious military undertaking if we're going to do that.
So let me push you a little more on this, Steve, and welcome others to chime in. You just said that a deal in which Iran hands over the nuclear material is unlikely. A military operation to secure it comes with a lot of risks. So are we going to end up with with an outcome where this war ends and the material stays there and hasn't been handed over, hasn't been safeguarded? What's going to happen to it?
Well, if we're in the scenario where Trump declares victory, says our military objectives have been accomplished and the conflict is over, yeah, I think and of course that's been the status since Operation Midnight Hammer, right? So I always believed that, once we undertook to bomb the Iranian nuclear sites, that that basically put us into the mode that the Israelis have long talked about of having to periodically mow the grass. And I would say what's going on right now is, the first instance in which we've mowed the grass. And yeah, you may not have to mow the grass, but I mean, there certainly would have to be a declaratory policy. That yes, okay, the conflict has ended, but here are our red lines, and if Iran steps across any of these red lines, we will have to renew the use of force. And one of the red lines, I think, would have to do with Iran trying to access the buried nuclear material.
I mean, one of the
Blaise, let me make one further point.
Sure.
If this, I think part of the calculation behind this operation was the hope that it would contribute to the demise of the Islamic Republic, and it may yet do that. We just don't know what's going to happen when the conflict ends. But it doesn't look like it's going to happen in the context during the conflict. If the Islamic Republic survives and the IRGC is in charge, I believe that when they do their sort of post-mortem among the survivors, what did we do wrong? What should we have done differently? How could we have avoided this? There will be loud voices saying, our critical mistake was not doing like North Korea. We had the wherewithal to produce a nuclear weapon. We chose to move slowly, and we chose to sign the JCPOA, to put the brakes on the program. That was our mistake. We should have made a mad dash covertly to produce a nuclear weapon. If we had nuclear weapons, the Americans and the Iranians, the Americans and the Israelis would never have done this to us. And our highest priority going forward has to be to produce a nuclear weapon. And I don't know if that will be the prevailing view, but I think certainly that view will be expressed and it will be seriously considered. And I think there's a strong chance that will become the policy. And therefore, knowing what has become of the 440 kilograms that could quickly be turned into a weapon has to be one of our top priorities following a cessation of hostilities.
Ambassador Edelman, you wanted to jump in?
No, I mean, I agree with that. I was just going to add, when you start toting up the risks of a military operation, this highly enriched uranium is in gaseous form in metal cylinders. And so while it's being extracted under fire, the danger of these things being hit by fire and rupturing is real, and it wouldn't give you a nuclear yield, but it would expose the troops involved to very serious levels of noxious gas and radiation.
If you assume that, it's interesting that one of the interveners here is Pakistan, which made a decision having India in mind, and I think having in mind its own permanent conventional inferiority, that it would need a nuclear weapon. And I guess what we're saying is Iran, or this regime, will come to the same conclusion. They will never be as conventionally strong as the United States, and obviously the combination of the United States and Israel. But what that leads to then, if you assume that, it might lead them to wait 3 years until Trump is gone, under the assumption that if he saw them going for it, he wouldn't hesitate to hit them again, and wait and see who's the next president. Because I think it is true that if there is any evidence that they're trying again, and there will be evidence because Israeli intelligence is good, and there are other sources of intelligence, including our own. they're going to get hit again during this 3-year period. And after it, under a new president, maybe not by us, but by the Israelis.
Hmm. I guess in that context, it's interesting to note that after the June 12-day war, after Operation Rising Lion and Midnight Hammer, it seems that the Iranians made the choice that they would reconstitute their missile program and not their nuclear program. Um, and in the context of what Steve said about the lessons they might learn from this, on the one hand, I think they have certainly demonstrated that investment in drones, in missiles and drones, has paid off in an ability to hold at risk much of the Middle East, but maybe not sufficiently. But on the other hand, it seems like it's much cheaper and easier to pursue than the nuclear program. And ultimately, you might need the missiles in order to deliver the nuclear weapon. So I wonder, um, would they make that choice again, or do you think they put the missile program aside and go all in on the nuclear program?
If you don't have you remember people always said Israel would never attack their nuclear program, the deterrent being Hezbollah and all its rockets and missiles. And it is, in fact, only after the Israelis decimated Hezbollah that they were willing then to attack Iran. So the logic of it, I think, suggests that once again, they try to rebuild the missile and drone program and go slower on the nuclear program.
Yeah, I mean,
Maybe
Let me ask,
logic, but
please,
one of the
go.
salient features, I think, of the conflict so far, and following along with Jinsa's very, very useful, in fact, I think, sort of essential daily update, is that although both we and the Israelis have claimed that we've destroyed 75% of their launchers, the number of launchers has stayed relatively stable for the last 2 weeks or so at around 120, and most recently I saw the IDF said 170 launchers, and the Iranians continue to launch. So while we have done enormous damage, we collectively, we and the Israelis, to the ballistic missile production facilities, to the launch points and launch facilities, they still have a residual capability to do this. And if the war ends, they will, I think, try to rebuild. And the drones, what we've been hitting are drone assembly plants, but the drone assembly plants have a sort of deep-rooted, substructure of component part manufacturers. I don't know how much damage we've done to those. So how quickly they'll be able to reconstitute the drone capability is another question. And the drones are the weapons that, in some sense, I mean, the missiles psychologically have done a lot of damage, but in terms of physical damage to energy infrastructure, to our bases, et cetera, it's been drones that have done the most damage.
I think if we look back at this war in as little as 5 years, there'll be another kind of revolution in military affairs in the sense that the Russian attacks on Ukraine and the Iranian attacks on their neighbors are, in a certain sense, the height of drone warfare. And I think, the history of warfare is new weapons are developed and then counter weapons or defenses are developed. And we're beginning to see that now. The Ukrainian counter drones, the Israeli efforts to develop lasers. And my guess is that it's not a guess. I mean, it's obvious that the Gulf Arabs are now going to invest very heavily, not just in the extremely expensive Patriots and so on, but in Ukrainian-style drone defenses. And so will we.
And
Yeah,
in
the
fact, we saw.
Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Qataris have all signed defense cooperation agreements with the Ukrainians, and precisely to Elliot's point on
Yeah, and President Zelensky was doing a
counter.
tour of the region this weekend, I believe.
Yeah, and
Uh,
I think you're going to see some serious Gulf investment in Ukrainian defense industry, which will not be happy news to President Putin.
Let me pivot really quickly with the couple minutes we have remaining and ask at least one question from our audience. Laura Kelly asks, How Israel factors into the negotiations? Is it expected that the U.S. will pressure Israel to end attacks if it reaches a deal, or are U.S. and Israeli objectives diverging greatly? Ambassador Edelman, let me start with you. If you think we touched on this earlier, but if you want to shed any additional light.
I mean, look, there's been enormous overlap in U.S.-Israeli objectives here, but not 100%. And there's also been a division of labor. One thing I don't think gets sufficient attention is that for all of the strikes that we've carried out, the Israelis have carried out more. Now, we've enabled a lot of that, but the Israeli Air Force has been a huge part of this. That being said, there is a potential for a divergence at the end of this, as there was at the end of the 12-day war in June, when the president insisted, even though I think the Israelis would have, if they'd had their druthers continued, that the conflict had to come to a halt. I think that Israelis, to Elliot's earlier point, would probably say, even though they might not be happy about it, good enough, because we don't think that they're going to come back, within the next 3 years, and then we'll have to see after Trump what transpires.
Thank you,
I agree.
Steve or Ambassador Abrams. Anything else on that point?
I agree with that. And I think that in a certain sense, they have no role in negotiating with Iran. They'll make their views known to us privately, but when the president says stop, they'll stop.
Yeah, I think the Israelis I don't think they're nervous about the 15-point plan. I mean, if that were the deal. I think what they're worried about is that there may be a negotiation and only some of the points are agreed to, and the U.S. side agrees to end the conflict without restrictions on the missile program, or without restrictions on support to other groups in the region. And that's the Israeli fear. But I think we've already at length discussed the likelihood of a diplomatic agreement, including any of the 15 points. So I don't think there's a huge risk of a falling out or disagreement between the U.S. and Israelis over this.
I think the biggest fear would be that the two sides agree to some very vague framework about what issues are to be negotiated between the two sides in the future in exchange for a ceasefire, either of some duration or of unlimited duration, because the Iranians are past masters at turning these negotiations into sort of an endless do loop of just endless hair splitting, and we unfortunately kind of fall into that trap all too easily, we Americans.
Well, let us hope that we don't, but if we do, we'll have all three of you back to discuss it. Thank you for your expertise and insights today, Ambassador Abrams, Ambassador Edelman, Steve. Thank you so much to our audience. Thank you for tuning in. Also, Hag Sameach, wishing you a sweet and joyous Passover. Please stay tuned to JINSA for all the latest updates, and we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon.
Thank you.